Last time we covered the development history of the Browning 1917 machine gun. Today we'll consider whether or not the gun was ready for warfare, both in terms of quality and chronology. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the machine gun 30 caliber Browning model 1917, which is very real and actually here, but we better double check that in the light box. This is of course a 37 1/2 inch long heavy machine gun, although heavy is stretching it because the total weight unloaded, no water, no tripod, is just 32.62 pounds. It has an average belt of 250 rounds of 30-06. Alright gang, last time we did some in-depth work on a very storied US machine gun, but today we'll get to shoot it and get some impressions at the end. In the meantime, however, we have to talk about how the Browning was used. Oftentimes this issue will go as follows. The US didn't know jack about machine guns. Then war were declared, and then John Browning saved the day. USA, USA. I'm basically going to poke holes into all of that, and I'm going to start way back in 1909. That's because viewer Martin kindly shared some pages of the 1909 Conference of General Staff Officers with me. Also, his return email didn't work. I'm sorry, Martin. For context, the US machine gun for this period was the Maxim Model 1904, the heaviest, most awkward Maxim gun in the world. But of course, it was adopted without a full understanding of what a machine gun should be in warfare. As we've covered numerous times before, the Russo-Japanese War would really become the sort of canary in the coal mine of machine guns' future development. And experience gained in that conflict drove both Russia and Japan to refocus their efforts on the supremely effective machine guns. And as we have seen, German observers really took the lesson to heart too. They started the most advanced machine gun program in the world, though they didn't outproduce Russia in terms of sheer numbers. They did fully commit to the power of this device on the battlefield. So Germany has remained the undisputed king of pre-war machine gun tactics. How was the US doing though on this front? Well, if you read the notes from 1909, they were just on the cusp of following the German footsteps. At least tactically, they knew they should be. Various speakers at this meeting would bemoan the poor state of US machine gun training. They would make some key recommendations based on the data that they had collected from observing the Russo-Japanese War. They should emulate the German programs, which they believed were on the correct path. Machine gunners should be better educated from the start, plucked from superior troops. They noted that rifle ranges were too short to train on indirect fire, and considered moving the machine guns to the artillery training fields. So they were taking the matter rather seriously. Brigadier General Murray even pointed out, in the opinion of Russian and Japanese writers, no weapon is so formidable, morally or materially, at distances below 1,600 yards as the machine gun. Now that's not to say that they were divining the future. There were also a lot of doubts. Some argued on whether or not the guns should be fired individually or in big batteries like artillery, which was largely judged pointless because the only way they could train for battery-fired machine guns was to have enough guns in one place to form a battery to do the training, which the US did not. Several officers also pointed out the current way wargaming was scored in the US underrepresented the value of machine guns and did not accurately display their destructive power. And I want to make this clear. They only really had maneuvers as a tool for testing against an opposing army. Geographically, the US had very friendly neighbors to the north, and Mexico was less of an enemy than it was a bipolar neighbor with an electric hedge clipper. Sure, he could wound you a bit with it, but it was hardly a national threat, and eventually the cord would run out. In that context, most warfare would either be against a weaker opponent, perhaps a colony, or any conflict with a major power would be primarily naval. So think about that. No real threat from the north, open terrain to the south, marine-style landings if you end up in a fight across the ocean, and then on top of that, your primary job, the one that you really end up ultimately doing a lot of, is minding the westward expansion. That's where all the action really was inside the country. Small groups of troops packing in gear by horse or donkey over long distances. Every bullet must be carried to the battle, and even in those 1909 notes, it's taken for granted that a standard infantry automatic rifle would be a huge waste of resources and quickly leave men devoid of ammunition in a fight. So while they wanted a greater role for the machine gun, they wanted it to be highly mobile, fired directly at the enemy, and to be judiciously expended, likely from hidden positions to protect key positions. It's no wonder the Maxim was actually kind of abandoned for one of the earliest adoptions of a light machine gun. Now, we discussed this guy a bit in our Hotchkiss Portative episode, but the gist is that the US went all in on light maneuverable direct fire machine gun technology. Now, while other nations balked at this concept, most would actually come back to it by the middle of the Great War, although they were using the light machine gun in order to go seek out and find and destroy heavy machine guns, which were actually doing all the damage. And yet that's the thing that the US just ditched. So the US kind of skipped a weird step. They had the perfect gun for fighting exactly what they were not up against. At least not at that time. And then we'll find out by the time we get into the war. Anyway, now all this is fine and excusable because no one in Ordnance was psychic, you know? They didn't understand. But then war were declared. And in this case, I am referring to the Europeans. The US was not yet at war. However, by the middle of 1915, it was absolutely evident that the machine gun was the king of the battlefield in terms of small arms technology. And at this point, the light machine gun concept was only just now catching on, with production to follow the next year for most of the countries that would have them. Instead, the big Maxims were doing most of the damage, both directly and more commonly, indirectly raining bullets down on beaten zones. Well, by the end of 1914, the US Machine Gun Board was on the matter, and in 1915 they would recommend the purchase of some 4,600 Vickers machine guns. And thankfully, these were really nice guns. Light, effective, reliable, honestly, great choice. After Colt managed to produce some trials models, these would be officially adopted, and then not purchased. The matter just kept bogging down, and honestly, for once, our man Crozier was on the right footing. He kept trying to push for more immediate commercial contracts, even if smaller ones, just to get the ball rolling and the tooling in place, and to prime private manufacturers to be ready to switch from production for Europe to production for the US. But at this point, Congress was still indecisive. The question of American neutrality was still unresolved, and the sort of spending required was well in excess of all funds spent on machine guns in the US up to this date. Still, eventually, $12 million were procured for Ordnance in 1916, specifically for machine guns. That's a lot. And it might not even be too late to get the US spun up in terms of battle readiness. But don't you worry, our boy, Chief of Ordnance Crozier, true to form, authorized the purchase of some 4,000 Vickers Model 1915s just 2 days after the US already entered the war. Now, I want to be clear here. On the declaration of war, after nearly 3 years of watching Europeans going at it, the United States had in inventory 670 Ben-A-Mercy light machine guns, 282 Maxim 1904s, and 158 Colt 1895 potato diggers. Just to review, these were the machine gun counts for various powers at the start of the war, 3 years before US entry, and yet the US still clocks in at 1,110. The predicted need by the War Department in 1917? 100,000 guns. It gets worse because all of the available guns, all of them, were deemed unfit to be shipped to Europe. Now, I have not found the entirety of why Ordnance stalled for so long. It frankly seems insane. However, I have a sort of suggestion or perhaps an excuse. Now, we know in hindsight roughly 2 million men would ship out of the US for the war, but that's just the number of men sent to Europe, and it wasn't clear when or how the war would end. So they projected a need for 5 million men in total when we first entered this thing. With those numbers, Ordnance would need 11,000 5,000 officers. By armistice, Ordnance had actually reached 5,800 officers. This actually seems like a respectable number, all things considered, except the chief of Ordnance believed strongly that Ordnance officers should be technicians first, and that to prepare someone to be a proper Ordnance officer, they would need a minimum of 2 years of training. That means if Ordnance had started bulking up their numbers in 1914, their first officers would only truly be ready in 1916. Now, 2 training schools were established, or at least available to help with this problem until the summer of 1917, which is when they were actually closed because experienced teachers were so short in supply, the entire training became on-the-job ad hoc training. Okay, but they still made it to 5,800 officers by the end of the war, and again, that sounds at least somewhat manageable, except that if we go back to April of 1917, before the US entry into the conflict, but easily within a time frame in which they should have been obvious that war was coming, they had 97 officers on hand. Oof. With that fact fresh on your mind, it is actually seemingly very likely that Colt was not given every bit of data they needed in a timely and helpful fashion, that decisions were likely being ordered and countermanded constantly, that confusion was the default state. And so when the American Expeditionary Force set sail, they made use of foreign equipment, largely the French Hotchkiss 1914, which would be the most common and arguably primary machine gun of US forces throughout the entirety of World War I. Where US rifles finally started showing up, this created a conflict in ammunition supply between the 30-06 and 8mm Lebel cartridges. While workable for heavy machine guns, we've seen the US buy show-shot light machine guns from the French chambered in 30-06 in order to avoid these issues. And finally, we can return to our gun for this episode, because in May of 1917, after the US entry into the war, we see Colt's manufactured Browning 1917 machine guns getting the full trials treatment. And as we saw last episode, they would actually be adopted, basically. I can't actually find a hard date. There are all sorts of glowing reports and recommendations, and then a flurry of activity to set up manufacture. It just kind of looks like wartime demand sort of swept into motion, and there's no actual like rubber stamp that I found when it's like, yeah, we're going with this, done, sealed. It just went. Now, as we know from last time, actual serial production would only get underway in January of 1918 at one of 3 eventual factories. Throughout all of this, the project was actually kept fairly secret, with limited access to Army officials or politicians. Colt's Vickers production would be spun up, but was really just a trickle in the face of a storm, and so, from the outside, people started getting pretty angry. Among them was former President Theodore Roosevelt, who led a coalition of men who began probing the Ordnance Department. The term paper gun just kept reappearing in the newspapers, as they questioned the idea of developing a new machine gun, as the US was already embroiled in a war. Included in their number was one Colonel Lewis of the Lewis machine gun, who also seemed to regularly suggest that if the Browning could not be immediately available, then some other gun should be purchased in larger numbers. Perhaps, well, you know, we just happen to have this Lewis gun. Well, they would all be silenced in February of 1918 when a demonstration was made using some of the now in production Browning machine guns. This was the same Congress Heights demonstration that debuted the Browning automatic rifle. So the question of a light machine rifle and a heavy machine gun were settled all at once for all to see. And in front of a swath of congressmen, arms inventors, foreign ordnance men, and dignitaries, the Browning 1917 was debuted and promptly smoked the crud out of the competition. And with the gun finally in US hands, and for the world to see, we can now show you what that might have looked like, because we can go shoot the one we shot. Let's take a look.
Some fellows take a notion and they sail across the sea to win a girl in foreign lands they roam. Now when it comes to sweethearts, there is just one place for me. I'll take a little girl that comes from home. I want a girl from a Yankee Doodle town. I want a girl from the USA. For eyes were brown, 'cause I am the old. Yankee Doodle gal that comes from... country jail. As long as she's from Yankee land, I know that she's true. And wedding bells will surely ring someday. I want a girl from the Yankee Doodle town. I want a girl from the USA. I wouldn't care if her eyes were blue or brown, 'cause I am not a pretty old Jane. I want a girl I can call my own, to marry me and settle down. The girl to be my pal is the Yankee Doodle gal.
With the guns coming off the assembly line, I need to back up just a bit and talk about US training. As I covered earlier, pre-war training was mostly direct fire, although every once in a while, more advanced notions entered the process. It's just that there really was no equipment to support it. In the end, the US was a lot like Britain. The machine gun units became something of a dumping ground for troops that didn't really fit in anywhere else. Again, this wasn't because no one understood the possibilities, but because institutional momentum was clearly winning out. It's much better to put all this emphasis on cavalry and other things that look good on parade or maneuvers or whatever metrics you're measuring, and then anybody that's sort of standing out poorly, just put them over machine guns because nobody looks at them anyway. The training issue came to a head in March of 1916 when Pancho Villa attacked Columbus, New Mexico. While I don't want to go deep into Mexican politics, the short story is Villa's forces were in somewhat of disarray, short on supplies, and desperate to regain their footing, so they attacked across the border in the US. At the time, Columbus had a population of just 350, Villa had a force near 1,500, but only committed 600 or fewer men to the fight as he did not have ammunition to hand out to the rest. Immediately south of the town was a cavalry camp which had roughly 270 combat troops, but half of them were not present on the night of Villa's raid. The Villistas attacked in the dark, completely surprising the town and the soldiers just outside. Despite a rushed defense, civilians were slain and buildings were burned. 4 Vbbsmyt 1909 machine guns were put into the fight, usually running 2 at a time while the other pair was being reloaded or otherwise serviced. And this is where things get tricky, because with history, if you read newspaper articles from the period, the Vbbsmyt was an embarrassment, a daylight gun that could only be operated with clear eyes because of its complicated fiddly mechanism. And while it is true that these Hotchkiss light machine guns are about as fiddly as it gets, it appears the story of the gun's failure is a bit overrepresented. Instead, we should look to the expert analysis, which was provided by one Captain Julian S. Hatcher of the Ordnance Department, a man who every aficionado of US firearms history will recognize by name, for his frequent research writings and overall expertise in American small arms. For the moment though, just know that this man knows what he's talking about. Hatcher was involved in the investigation of the guns at Columbus. In his view, while not necessarily an ideal gun, the Vbbsmyt had functioned acceptably and was likely a great aid in the defense of Columbus. The problem was that in the dark, with non-uniformed enemies, with non-uniformed civilians, and otherwise general chaos and fire in all directions, well, there just weren't many opportunities to be sure of what you were shooting at. Initial setup probably lagged, placement was probably poor, organization probably out the window. What the US needed in this instance wasn't a new gun, they needed better training, more reflexive training. He conveyed this information to the Chief of Ordnance, Crozier, who was happy to hear that they had a problem that could be solved, because at this moment, he was absolutely being eviscerated by the press. In order to avoid any future embarrassment, Crozier insisted Hatcher accompany some newly purchased machine guns, which were being issued to the US forces massing in the South in response to Villa. These were, of course, the emergency purchased .303 Lewis guns, so Crozier was now rebuilding his reputation by demanding training that highlight how the Lewis gun was jam-proof. life gets weird sometimes. And so, in the summer of 1916, our same Julian Hatcher, having delivered the Lewis guns, would set up a machine gun school in Harlingen, Texas. Here he would teach every single available machine gun in the US inventory at the time, and in the process he continued to learn just how much was being lost to the effects of poor training. Hatcher tells a story in his own notebook, one that I find instrumental in understanding why it can be so hard to differentiate between a poor mechanism and a poor handler, a poorly trained person. He gives an example of a typical officer that has come in for training and swears up and down that his guns are terrible. He's had them for years and they're completely worthless by design. They never run right. Let's look. He assured me that no one could get his guns to shoot more than 2 shots. His guns were placed on the table, and he was told to have his men gather around and pay close attention as we were going to explain the function of each piece. My assistants and I then took the guns to pieces and explained just how each piece worked, but at the same time casually pointed out some defects. We would say, for example, now the firing pin must have a good rounded point, so that it will indent the primer properly without puncturing it. This firing pin has no point at all. Naturally, the gun would not fire in that condition, so let's put in this new firing pin. Hatcher would repeat this same process with basic loading and operation instructors, every time sort of going, now of course no one would do it this way, knowing very well that they were doing it that way. And by the end, all the guns were running flawlessly, and the officers were much better aware of the maintenance and training needed to have the guns ready for a fight. With this US entry into the war, it was time to get some of that experience back to the development side. So Hatcher was then sent to the Springfield Armory in April of 1917 to assist with testing and deploying the Model 1917. Again, he would also establish a school which taught not just the operation and malfunction drills, but the core concepts of the mechanism to the point of blindfolded assembly. Doctrine, repair, quick troubleshooting, and a lot more. And this wasn't direct to troops. This was actually done to train officers, inspectors, armorers, and even some civilians working in the field. People who would go on to instruct others or needed to be informed about how this thing works. From there, Hatcher's lessons would be built into proper schools at sort of a troop level wherever they were needed. With the declaration of war, the US set up 16 National Guard cantonments. These were expedient bases that had simple wood administrative structures, while tents served as the barracks. This obviously limited the options for climate regions, so many were in the south. The War Department also started construction on 16 National Army camps. These were fancier and had 2-story wooden barracks and could be heated for the winter. As machine guns became available, the initial course of action was to send 30 to each of the National Guard cantonments and 50 to each of the National Army camps. These were almost exclusively Marlin 1917s, that modification of the old potato digger, specifically contracted for training only. By April of 1918, a year into the War Department decided on having a central machine gun training camp, just like the British had actually decided to do. They selected Camp Hancock in Augusta, Georgia, which was already home to a specialized ordnance school. The machine gun version would now focus on providing instruction on the new Browning 1917 specifically. This would in turn be followed by an automatic rifleman school for the BAR and an overall machine gun officers training school for men who are responsible for men who have machine guns. Training camps were also set up in France, providing training much closer to the conflict. It's interesting to note that one of the instructors in France carried a familiar name: Val Browning, son of John Moses. Born in 1895, he had followed in his father's footsteps. Withdrawing from his engineering studies at Cornell, he aided in establishing the manufacture of Browning machine guns for the US government. Unlike his father, Val did accept a commission as a second lieutenant in the Ordnance Department and was sent to France to help train future machine gun instructors, much like Hatcher had done at home. And so we have photographs of him teaching throughout the war, all the way up until the armistice. Now this sounds like the US machine gun program is finally getting it together. But unfortunately, Val and some of the others began noticing some issues in the field. The 1917 was an excellent weapon, but it wasn't quite perfect, and the problems were finally showing through. These included poor heat treatment of the breech blocks, poorly milled barrel extensions, leaking water jackets, and all of these would actually be rapidly resolved when they were made aware. More serious were two big issues. One, the bottom plates were blowing out of the receivers. Basically, that bottom and side of the receiver, they weren't holding together, they were just pumping apart. And this was also a much more noticeable problem on the first attempts to produce an aircraft version of the 1917. Due to the higher rate of fire and more severe operation, those first aircraft 1917s were cracking up real fast. This would stall the program until after the war had ended, so no World War I aviation Brownings. Now the answer would be really simple, it's just a reinforcing yoke, though most were only implemented post-war to guns now largely in storage. Issue 2 was a bit trickier and largely has remained unsolved because the breech lock cams and screws were a failure point. This kicked off a bunch of arguments, but nothing seems to have come from it because the guns were still leagues ahead in terms of endurance at this point. It's like the weakest issue on a gun that really runs well anyway. So as far as teething issues go, these were fairly modest problems. Honestly, the biggest issue with the 1917 had nothing to do with the gun itself. Instead, it was a fault with the range tables provided by Springfield. These had been mathematically calculated for the .30-06 cartridge and the Browning's barrel, but they had not been exhaustively tested, and by the time the matter was discovered in June of 1918, it represented a major effort to fix. Tests were conducted, but variations in ammunition, weather, air pressure, they all created a nightmare in order to solve. I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we'll test it and we'll get sort of in that mid-zone, but being able to run the thing around, get all the math just right, and have it work to the point of human lives being, saved or killed, honestly, other nations did a better job of this. The British were masters of it. They had really gotten down to using the machine gun as artillery, and it had even been suggested much earlier in the war that the US just go over to .303 to begin with. And I'm going to be really honest and probably a little controversial here. At this point, it kind of makes a lot of sense that the US should have gone to .303. They had already adopted the P14 and the Vickers guns, both just being reworked to .30-06. A lot of time could have been saved by just going straight to .303 and sharing resources on the front line and apparently the British range tables. Instead, the American Expeditionary Force largely avoided overly complex combined arms strategies between machine guns and attacking infantry for fear of dropping rounds on their buddies' backs of their heads. The risk of friendly fire was pretty high. Frankly, from what I have read, this issue remained with the US Army for decades. I mean, the tables got cleaned up and improved, but we never really got to the point that the British got with those machine guns. Instead, we see planners in World War II finally giving up and just going, nuts, use the mortars. And that's what we did. All right, we have training, we have our teething issues, we have repairs, and we have the range tables sort of sorted. How did the guns actually do in a fight? Well, pretty well, briefly. First combat for the 1917 was a small detachment of the 79th Division on the 26th of September 1918. So that gave it upwards of 47 days of total combat. Maybe. Yeah, much like the BAR, the 1917 was a weapon actually meant for the spring offensives in 1919, but the war ended in November of 1918. Which at least gave those two guns some use, as opposed to, say, the Pedersen device. A secret weapon that thankfully never saw deployment, ultimately saving the US some more of its reputation. Now, despite the limited service, we do have a quote on our gun from the commanding officer of the 79th. During the 5 days my 4 guns were in action, they fired approximately 13,000 rounds of ammunition. They had very rough handling due to the fact that the infantry made constant halts, causing the guns to be placed in the mud. The condition of the ground these 5 days was very muddy, and considerable grit, etc. got into the working parts of the guns. Guns became rusty on the outside due to the rain and wet weather, but in every instance when the guns were called upon to fire, they fired perfectly. During all this time, I had only one stoppage, and it was due to a broken ejector. Also fielded with the 80th Division, who had previously had the Vickers gun, the Browning received more praise, as that unit noted the loss of some 50 Vickers guns in their first offensive due to breakages and other repair-related issues. After switching to the Browning and going on another offensive through Saint-Georges and on past Beaumont against what they called heavier resistance, just one single 1917 was lost, and that was due to a direct hit. Post-war testing by the French also revealed the 1917 to be, in all likelihood, the most reliable sustained fire machine gun of the war, had it been given the chance to really fight. Largely, however, it had not. The gun was effectively still in frontline trials, limited issue trials, and therefore saw really limited combat, even within that tiny time frame. So we're left to wonder what might have been its true reputation. Or not, because interestingly, that damn system is still, for the most part, in use today, over 100 years later. But not as a pure 1917. The pure one only lasted a few years after the war, because in 1921, a program was begun to perfect the Browning. The result was the 1917 A1, which had various slight dimensional changes and reinforcements, and a new rear sight. Nearly all 1917s would be converted to this pattern in the 1930s, and so original 1917s are extremely rare to come by today. So I want to especially thank William for loaning us his when he had it. It has since moved on to a new owner, and I am unable to visit one of the few museum examples due to travel issues, so I've had to do most of this show without my usual prop, but I think we muddled through. Now let's turn back to our inventor. While preparing production of the model 1917, John Moses Browning would rent an apartment in Hartford, working closely with ordnance officials and manufacturers to perfect the production of his gun. During this process, he apparently had a number of his decisions poked about or otherwise sort of refused by government representatives, which apparently led him to write a letter declaring, "If there's anyone down there who understands these guns better than I do, send him up and I'll go home." They dialed it back. Now, I did mention last time that he was offered a commission into the US Army at the rank of colonel, and he did refuse that, and it's been said that he made it known that despite being a very useful title at wartime factories, it's not one he would dare to take back home out west. And if that doesn't endear you to the man, there's the matter of money. Browning had a contract with Colt to earn $50 in royalties per gun manufactured, but the government had negotiated with Colt to provide licensing to other companies. That meant they had to reach an agreement with Browning. At the time, it was established his potential earnings for the war could have been as high as $4.5 million. When the US representative entered negotiations, he started with sort of a low ball of $1,250,000. Browning immediately accepted the offer and stated, "Major, if that suits Uncle Sam, it's all right with me." This one-time sum shaved a considerable amount off the cost of production for the guns, and while the whole contracts were not fulfilled, guns based on Browning's patent continue to be produced today. But those are all definitely post-war concerns, so we're going to skip them for now, and let's go ahead and refocus on the 1917 itself and get Mae's opinion on handling it. Alright, once again, we had plenty of room for Mae because we do not have the gun. Everybody panic.
Why?
Because those are rare. We could have had A1s for days, but an actual pure 1917 is hard to come by. So we were lucky to have it when we did.
Yes.
And because I hoped we would get our hands on another one, but I wasn't sure, you did get some extra time with it.
Yes, so thank you, one, obviously Will, for letting us borrow it, and two, thank you, Michael, for spending so much time. He actually helped me showed me how to take it apart and put it back together again, just so I'd have some hands-on experience with it, which was fantastic.
That man was a hustle machine. It was like having an extra one of us around.
It was amazing.
We managed to get deep into the gun. You handled it pretty well, so you can give us at least a strong opinion for someone that's experienced it all of one time. But let's start with the simple.
Okay.
Ergonomics. You are first handed this thing because we do hand Mae all the guns.
Pass it off.
Here it goes. Ugh. Okay. What kind of baby are you holding?
Well, this baby, it looks like a box with a tube on it.
I love how this is the mime for box with a tube.
Well, I didn't know. I was like, I don't know. I don't want to be
If you would
handling
like to
something
support us-
cylindrical on freaking camera. I feel like that'd be weird.
If you'd like to support the show and Mae's mime lessons, no, I'm just kidding. So it's a rectangular box
Yeah.
with a cylinder bolted on the front of it.
Pretty much.
And in that case, hold on, before we go too deeper, our box is our receiver, which
Yeah.
has like everything but the barrel in it.
Pretty much.
And our cylinder is a water jacket that surrounds the barrel.
Yeah.
And that keeps it cool and even for firing.
Yeah.
If nobody's experienced this much of the show so far, there you go.
Hooray.
So this reminds you of exactly how many machine guns?
Well, I mean, totally none. It's not like any of the 08 or the Vickers or anything like that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of boxes with cylinders. And in this case, it's kind of interesting because this is the first box with cylinder that we've encountered that is not from the Maxim family. It just looks like it.
True. It is outside the family, but still a lot of the gross look of it is still pretty similar, I would say.
Okay. Now, how's that weight?
So the weight actually is not too bad. I would say it's closest probably to the Vickers, whereas the others, like the 08, it's like there's a several pound difference. Now if I was just picking it up and just handling, if you were to pass me the Vickers, here, I'm gonna take the Vickers, okay. All right, and I'm gonna take the Browning, okay.
Both at once.
Yeah, no.
I didn't see you put the other one down.
Yeah, no, I didn't put the other one down. So
Okay.
this is some serious feats I'm doing here. If I were just handed both of them and were to just be told, okay, which one weighs more, I probably wouldn't be able to perceive the difference because the weight between the two is just so close, you know?
Fair. And some of that is causing confusion on the back end. So I'm going to get lit up for this, but our weight measurements on some of these episodes may not have been accurate because
tried.
am trying very hard. We weighed the 08. I remember that.
Yes, we did do that.
But I don't remember if that was before or after the episode because it's been driving me insane. The short answer is
and I think the Vickers we weighed on a different scale, didn't we?
I have all these detailed books and manuals and all this stuff. And getting the empty, dry weight of a machine gun
It's hard.
is something that you can Google in 2 seconds, and I can almost guarantee you it's wrong. And so I have a solemn promise that the next time I manage to get up to Springfield, I will grab every one of these systems I can and put them all on the same bathroom scale and sort this out. Because as far as my notes are right now, it looks like theoretically the Vickers Mark I is the lightest. The 1917 is right behind it. But then, and I have not handled one of these, the Vickers 1915, the one that would have been adopted by the U.S., I can't figure out why it would be significantly heavier.
Yeah.
And yet, according to what I'm seeing in this reading,
Supposedly it is.
it's slightly heavier than the 1917.
So
I would like to confirm that. I don't have what I consider to be a strong enough primary source to name it. However, I will say right now, those three guns are so close in weight that it's almost negligible.
yeah, it's almost imperceivable. So that's why I'm like, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two, but unlike that, the 08, yeah, several pounds difference. And I feel like it balances differently a little bit too.
Yeah, so the 08 often gets listed as being many pounds heavier than it actually is if you check like Wikipedia and stuff, and I'm not sure why, but when I've weighed them, they've come up much lighter.
Yeah. So
same thing, the 08 was actually a German attempt to make the gun lighter. So they took some weight out of it already by the time that gun's around, and then the Vickers gets lighter than that. So the 1917, though, is contending very well as one of the lightest possible heavy machine guns of World War I. So that's good.
Cool.
And we've over-explained the crap out of that.
All right.
So
Who never knew that?
what else is different about this box with cylinder?
So there are two differences, like two main ones, two obvious ones, but I'm just going to briefly talk about them both. The first is obviously it's got a charging handle as opposed to
That lever.
yeah, the lever that I'm used to, like on the 08 and even the Vickers. Like I'm so used to the lever with those big box cylindrical machine guns. So that's an obvious difference there. But we'll get more into handling that in the shooting section, I think.
Yeah.
And then the second one is that single-handed grip.
This is very controversial.
Yeah, we haven't experienced that. Every of the machine guns of that gross look has always been spades with paddles for pressing for triggers. So
We have shot single-handed machine guns, though, in the form of light machine guns, and also very specifically the Hotchkiss 1914.
yes, that one had an actual grip, but there were reasons why they set it up that way, right?
Well, the Hotchkiss started with a shoulder system. So you would be able to put your hand on there and you had a shoulder like a rifle. And that's because, again, earlier machine gun thought was much more direct fire focused. So the idea is that you get behind it like a rifle and you follow someone around and you shoot on the move,
Makes sense.
And then when machine guns become little artillery pieces, Well, then things change, and the sort of spade grip becomes popular because it's more about that sort of hybrid
being able to
of
transition easily.
No, it's this thing where you want to be able to have the room wherever you're set up to be able to split the difference between controlling the gun direct fire, so running both spades and point the gun.
And just being able to do adjustments like on the azimuth, essentially, or like horizontally.
Yeah, so you want to be able to shoot with it on the go, which means you want two hands on it and good control over it. Mm-hmm. And you might say, well, then why wouldn't you want the rifle setup? Because a rifle setup would be really controllable. But the problem with that is trying to get down low enough and up high enough and do funky stuff with it can get tricky. And then two, when you're not using it for direct fire and you're relying on the tripod and calculations, now all this shoulder stock stuff is getting in your way.
I could see that.
And so the spade grip has, for the most part, sort of split the difference between those two needs, and it's done very well, and it's remained very popular. At the time, though, the U.S. had more experience with single-handed grips because of the Colt 1895 potato digger under lever machine gun.
Sure, okay.
That thing ran a single grip. And then when you come into this area of not necessarily direct fire and relying more on the tripod, the question of whether you have a single or double grip isn't that big of a deal. Mm-hmm. And when you tell the U.S. this thing was developed as a single grip, if you want it to be a spade, we have to add this extra linkage, then we have to test it, and we have to go make the dies, and we have to make... It seems
time and cost effort, I guess they were just like,
well, later versions of the gun have spade grip, so it's obvious that you can do it to that system.
Okay.
But when you have like the press breathing down your neck and you're just trying to get this gun out, you know what? The trigger works. The handle's right there.
You can't argue with it if it works.
So did you find any advantages to that handle?
Well, I mean, I personally enjoyed it. It was interesting. So I actually did shoot it, which I don't know how much we want to get into that without getting into the shooting section, because honestly, I handled it with my left hand. That was a unique experience that I got to really have.
Well, I think that invites us to talk about the tripod, because
that's
I
fair.
don't remember you consciously choosing to shoot it with your left hand.
No, so it was interesting. I honestly thought that I just wanted to be able to make some adjustments potentially to like the height or whatever, and I thought it might, and I guess I just naturally grabbed it with my left hand and started having my hand ready to use the wheel underneath to be able to manipulate it vertically.
So when we shot this gun...
just to do fine adjustments to the elevation.
Right. So when we shot this gun, we were on a very short distance range.
Yep. I think we're about 50 yards, I think is what we had it at.
It was very limited.
Yes.
So it looks impressive, but make sure you always read those markers.
Yeah.
People get upset at us for this. We can't control where and when we can access the guns. They belong to other people.
Yes.
And honestly, choosy beggars.
Yeah, we're going to shoot it where we can, essentially, so we at least have some of a sampling to give you guys as much as possible.
And if anybody out there has access and time and the availability to do these sorts of tests,
at longer ranges,
let us know and we'll just tell people about your test. Like, we'd love to share that stuff. We're here for everybody to learn as much as they can. It's just that we're finite beings of, they can occupy only one space and time at a time.
And what we're putting out here is meant to be built upon.
Right.
Nothing we're giving is a finite. It's always growing. We're always finding more information. So please give us more.
I look forward to being 70 years old and have people yelling at me that I got it all wrong. And it's going to be like, good, that means you found something new.
Yeah, it's exciting.
We got to demo the guns and at least experience them and show people how they work, which is all we really are set for doing right now. And your natural inclination was to go left-handed on that thing, and start working the controls of the tripod.
Yeah, it felt like it was more of a natural setup. Now, granted, if I needed to, I think if I were on the battlefield and like if I were in the moment and I guess just wanting to really feel like I had the most control, I probably would have switched. Like I probably would have switched to my right hand. So
this is actually another point where we fail because we don't run a machine gun team. Mm-mm. We don't train up a bunch of people to assist her and then put them on camera assisting her. The way this gun is set up, it's set up for someone to run the gun and someone else to do all this adjustment, I'm sure. On
the tripod. So specifically, where you would adjust it to adjust it horizontally or on the azimuth, like to be able to move it around, you would have to reach forward of the tripod to the front of it and unhook it there.
Which is an uncomfortable position for a gunner that's seated behind the gun.
Right. It makes no sense.
Let's go through the controls real quick. On that tripod, there is a knob at the front that you can loosen, and that allows you to swivel the gun.
Yeah.
Okay. There are two knobs above that allow you to adjust the marking plate for that, but they're really not necessary for you to do anything with the gun itself. It's just so you can keep track of what you are doing. And then if you want to do elevation, there's 2 ways to do it. There's a gross elevation lever that you can unlock, and it's just free. And it's just you're holding the gun
about
up.
free, it's just free.
Right. And all over the place.
Yeah.
And then if you lock that out, you can still do fine adjustment with this wheel at the rear, and that's what you were using.
And honestly, I did it on range while we were shooting, like in the actual shooting segment, I do actually manipulate it because I wanted to make sure that I at least showed this is something that you can easily do one-handed. And it did adjust pretty easily, but it still held its place. It held it tight, which was great. Now,
you look down the sights of the gun. Mm-hmm. How were they as sights?
I mean, I distinctly remember... I'm trying to, again, this has been 2 years, so we're going to hopefully pop a picture of this too as a reminder too. But I remember it was a little new U-notch that essentially I had for the rear sight. And then the front sight, I remember it had a protector over it, just a rounded protector, and then just, obviously the front sight poked up in the middle. But I don't remember it being hard to read. I just, we unfortunately just didn't get an ability to really test it for long distance accuracy.
To me, it felt a lot like a machine gun Buffington sight. Like the same thing that we see on the 1903 Springfields, the same thing that we see going all the way back to the trapdoors. There's this target.
Yeah, that's actually not that far off.
It's like a targety sight that's shown up on this thing. And don't get me wrong, for being able to dial it in and get exactly what you want out of the gun as a computational system, I thought it was very good. The problem I have with it is that I don't think it lends itself to direct fire. So the complete opposite of this would be like what we saw on the Hotchkiss or even on like a Santa Tia 1907, which we have not gotten our hands on, but I have seen them. And they are just like a front sight, like a big thumb-sized front sight.
That's massive.
And a big old notch at the rear. And it just reads like a flat notch sight. And on the center of the front sight, even like the Lebel and Berthier's of later war, you may have a notch. You know what I mean? But they're very chunky sights. And what they are is they're rapid acquisition. Because in their mind, if you're dialing it in on the tripod, then you're dialing it on the tripod.
So why would you need like the finest sight for little tiny for the most accuracy? Like you're already going to have it all set up and ready to go.
Right. In their minds, if you're taking your time with it, you have the time to sit there and be like, is that the center? I think that's the center. Let's get this. Because you're not going to be in a hurry to set it for 2,000 yards.
Right. It's going to be something you take your time with.
But when somebody's on top of you, you're going to be like, oh, crap. And you're going to go for sight acquisition. And it's just pure.
That makes sense.
They read like shotguns. I mean, they just point,
Yeah.
And so I tend to theoretically favor that. I do think it's a little busy of a rear sight.
That's fair. I guess I could see that.
But again, what we did was we just locked it out and shot at it.
Oh, yeah, no, we locked it out. So literally the only thing that I should have to do was just do the fine elevation adjustments, which I, again, tried.
So I want you to play pretend for a second. If you had to shoot and move with that gun, how would you have ended up doing it?
Yeah, so if I've got targets coming at me, and I've got to get on point. I've got to start shooting. I'm gonna grab that grip with my right hand. I'm probably gonna use my left hand to just brace up against the box, like the receiver box, essentially. And then I'm just gonna hunker down and try to really get at it. But I think you're right that the sight might be a little too busy, and that I'm probably just it's gonna take me a second to be able to quickly start hitting.
I could see that being a very difficult ride compared to some other guns.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, we didn't get to try that aspect out. It might be very easy because maybe the tripod's better or something.
Maybe.
But that's a potential vulnerability of the system. And they certainly did a lot of work to redo those sites post-war. So there may be some thoughts there as to some deficiencies.
Fair enough.
Let's keep on the gun for a second, though, because we kind of gotten all mixed up. But the one part we missed in all this is sort of loading and feed.
That's true. We didn't really touch on that yet.
Yeah. So what was that like?
So for us, we actually loaded it in which I pulled the lock back up at top and I actually opened her up so that I could feed it that way. Just so essentially, again, these aren't our guns and we're trying to be careful. And I thought I think you and I both had the same thought on range that day where we were like, it might look kind of cool if y'all could see it.
Yeah, you see the extractor grab over and everything. It's a nice shot.
Yeah, so we actually loaded it in and it took me like 1 or 2 attempts to kind of really get the finesse of it. And honestly, you just pull it in. Like right. I was being too delicate with it. You really just want to pull it in there. And then you hear it click. You see it click. Like you can actually see it in the video, which is kind of cool. And then you just close her up, charge it, and she's good to go.
Right. Now, you do not have to open that action.
You don't. No, you
can
just
feed
pull
her
it through.
Yank like you would on like a Maxim, like we saw in a lot of those footage. Just yank it through and then charge it. Although in this case, you don't have to charge it the one time.
Yeah, that was pretty
There's
convenient.
no carrying that one. And the reason for that is because the breech block on this gun is the camway for the feed. So if the breech block's moving and everything's locked down, then it's going to run the feed. Whereas in the like the MG08,
yeah,
the feed system is tied to the recoiling components. So
Okay.
like the barrel. So when you charge the locking action on a 08, it's not moving the belt. They're totally disconnected from each other. It's the recoil force that's doing it. So a little bit of an advantage there in that you always can do that. And if you want to disengage it, you can open the cover and then you don't have to worry about that thing grabbing and feeding.
Yeah.
So you can disengage the system if you want. However, it is usually engaged, which is, I think, better because it's just one of those things of not having to carry the one in your
I
head.
get it. Yeah, that's fair.
And then when you have a feed issue, it's a one-time fix. And we did have a few of those. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I remember at the very beginning, they thought that there was an issue with the gun, like an actual like delicate issue somewhere in there that was causing an issue with the feeding where it would stop after a few rounds. It would snag almost. Like
Right.
it was having trouble picking up the round or something. So like, didn't we determine ultimately it was something to do with the cloth belts?
Sort of. So the cloth belt was stretched because it's where do you get cloth belts for these? And it had its tendency to, as being stretched, it wanted to pile up at the front edge on the right. And it would sort of pile up until it sort of tied up the system.
Right.
Now, what I ended up doing is we would make sure that there was enough mass to sort of keep it running and not wanting to tie up at the front. And then on the other aspect of it is, I think there was like a burr. I'm trying to remember now because I fixed a couple of guns that day. But I ended up finding like
You literally ended up diagnosing fixing like 5 guns.
I want to say I found a burr or something that was right there, and we just took a quick file swipe to it,
Yeah.
and it stopped grabbing the cloth, and that was it. So once we figured out that little pileup issue that we had,
It just ran.
it
Was amazing.
I've had that is honestly we've had a lot of machine guns on the show. Every single one of them, other than the BAR, has had some sort of issue that had to be fixed. I mean,
Yes.
hauled in and fixed. And that particular gun had none. You know what I mean? And that means it survived 100 years of being played with, and it's in 30-06, so you can shoot it all day. You know what I mean? It's not like some of the other guns we've had that are harder to get a hold of ammo for. This thing, I'm sure, has been run for a century. And it still is running. Like, it is a terrific little machine, and I greatly appreciated being able to work on it. And I'm kind of glad that we at least had the cloth belt jam, because it got us to feel out what it's like to clear jam in that, which was
that was kind of cool.
every time, yank belt, rack action, and you're back in business. Just one rack.
Fantastically simple.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I guess that's kind of winding us down to the final issue, which is one that we did not get to experience, but we need to talk about. And it wraps into the question of how comfortable are you with this in the war? But is this a gun that you would be willing to run in World War I, even knowing the problem with the sighting tables?
So guys, just as a reminder with this, essentially they miscalculated where the beaten zone was with this, where the shots were falling. And unfortunately, they just weren't falling in the right place, and that could potentially bonk your own infantry in the back of the head if you're not careful. So just to kind of give you guys a reminder.
Nobody wants to be shot in the back with 30-06.
No, so that is a very dangerous thing to be concerning of.
Yes. That effectively, I mean, that really hurts.
No, that does really hurt. I mean, I don't know how comfortable I'd feel taking it into battle without at least being able to test it myself.
Yeah. Okay, so in the long range aspect, we're deeply uncomfortable with the math involved.
Yes, I think that needs to be reworked.
But they fixed the tables for the most part, so you'd be able to use it as well as some other countries.
True.
So,
And it'd be good for still short and mid-range, presumably.
right. Well, it's also okay for long range, it's just you don't want to combine it with your own guys moving up.
Yes, exactly. So it'd be just not for all situations.
Yes. And there may have also been some issues with the reinforcement of the receiver and things like that. There's a couple things that sort of pile in on this that are not well understood, and they all get sort of fixed all at once together, and it's hard to piece down where the mistakes really were.
Right.
But it's unfortunate to say the Browning 1917 is not one of the best guns for long-range work in World War I simply because of the support network around the gun rather than the gun itself.
Mm-hmm.
So with that as a caveat, now we get to ask the real question of, assuming the math is correct, the functional gun, the device, how comfortable are you with that in the Great War?
So me personally, I would be comfortable with it for several months. I definitely would be. But after a while, we do know those guns started to shake themselves apart. So if I was able to get like that emergency yoke attachment and that is a very simple fix. It's a very easy, simple fix that they managed to do.
You can see that reinforcement on modern, like Browning derived, like 1990s and stuff. You see it at the bottom. They're like, bolt this thing together because it's going to shake apart. Mm-hmm. So it was a real problem. Yes.
And that's why I said I would be very comfortable the first several months. And then if I was able to get that emergency yoke on it, yeah, I'd be hecka comfortable keeping that gun on hand with me for the war.
I would hope that would have been, this is all pure speculation.
Yeah, no, there's not so much we can go into it.
That would have been available by spring of 1919 in large numbers because it was really as simple as taking a big bolt of metal and putting it over the bottom of the receiver.
Yeah, that's all
it was. We know that what limited action they did have was not enough time and endurance testing in the fight that I have not seen a single report of one cracking up as used in battle over the few months they were used in battle.
Right.
So I'm gonna have to agree with you.
Yeah, whereas it gets the yes, it's just you want to make sure after a while it's got that yoke. That's about it.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard because we're essentially talking about a gun that did not get to have even a few months in combat because you look at like the Hotchkiss, you look at the Saint-Étiennes, you look at the Vickers, all these other guns, they went into the fight and had immediate problems just like the Browning did. But then the fight kept happening and they would get their improvements issued to them. You know what I mean? Like there's always, you never want to be on the Gen 1 of anything. You know
there's going to be the problems that come with it.
But the Browning 1917 never actually left Gen 1 during World War I. And so it's a very hard gun to judge because we're judging it in potentia, you know? Like it's very awkward. But to me, I think it's, this isn't just personal pride or anything like that. I do fundamentally believe it is the best of the heavy machine guns that managed to eke its way into World War I.
Ooh.
However, that's with the asterisk of you need to put a mod 1 on that. You know what I mean? Or mod 2 on that. You need to actually put, it's the asterisk of it needs to have an asterisk because it did need literally a bolt at the bottom and a couple heat treatment differences, and that's it.
And the range table's adjusted.
Well, yeah, but that's support. So that's the same thing though. Like, can you blame the gun for someone not doing the math?
Yeah, no, honestly, yeah, you're right. That's not blaming the gun. That's an issue with the people as opposed to the gun itself.
Yeah, that's the planning around the gun. That's the support network for the gun.
Fair point.
All right, well, overall, the Browning 1917 is a pretty cool gun.
Yeah.
I'm glad we got to play with one, so thanks again, guys, for loaning that to us.
Yes, thank you.
And then otherwise, I think we're pretty good, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to give the gun back, so I'm kind of sad.
We can't even get it back if we wanted to. All right, well, stay tuned after the credits for any updates, and thank you again for tuning in.
Night, guys.
Alright guys, this update is going out to our friends at the CELA report. Behind the scenes, they are currently having some issues with Patreon and other payment processors because they made a cloth patch in the shape of an AK-74. So the depiction of a firearm was enough for them to be removed from PayPal. So if you like CELA report, if you're one of our patrons that heard our podcast with them, we had Miles Vining on, maybe go give them a look, go give them a little support where you can, because they're kind of having a rough time of it for having made a picture of a firearm. If you're wondering why that might strike home with us, well, we sell pictures of firearms and we collect money through PayPal to do that, so I feel like we might be at risk there. So as always, you can support us over at Patreon or Subscribestar, or just keep on watching these videos. Alright, have a good one.